July 25th at 7 p.m., live from the stage of the Peterson Tech campus of the Westbrook Walnut Grove High School. I'm your host, Wendy Rogatsky. You know that many people are surprised that there is a Plum Creek and that Laura and her family did live in Walnut Grove, Minnesota for a short time. Our guest, Pamela Smith Hill, is an American authoress with many works including Laura Ingalls, A Writer's Life, and Laura Ingalls Wilder's Pioneer Girl, the Annotated Autobiography. She has researched the Wilder literature and found where history and story come together and where they diverge. Please welcome Pamela Smith Hill. Pamela.
Hi, Wendy.
Hello. First question, how did it feel to pore over the letters and papers of Laura Ingalls Wilder?
It was quite an experience. It was also very humbling and exciting at the same time. For me, what was most exciting was reading the rough draft version of Pioneer Girl for the first time. That was back, I believe, in 2006 when I was working on research for A Writer's Life. And I knew I needed to see the rough draft version of Pioneer Girl. I wanted to understand better how Wilder approached her own life and what her writing style was like, even in rough draft form. There was so much I wanted to learn. And it had taken me a while to track down the rough draft. I had to view it on microfilm over the holidays at Washington State University. It was very lonely in the back corner of the library looking at microfilm, but it was really powerful and exciting too because I could see her images. Pioneer Girl, of course, was written on Big Chief and 50/50 tablets using pencil and, looking at her handwriting, reading where the Little House books really began, which was with Pioneer Girl. That was very, very exciting.
Do you think that through your research you've gotten to know her, and if she was alive, do you feel like you would have been good friends?
That's an interesting question. I don't know how I feel about wanting to be friends with a great writer. Yes, that would be lovely. But for me, what's more important is to be engaged with her work. I suspect if I did get to know Laura Ingalls Wilder, we would probably not talk so much about her books and her writing, but we would share our love of the Ozarks. I grew up about 40 miles from Rocky Ridge Farm, where Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote her books. And I suspect we might talk about the sound of the cicadas and the lightning bugs at night and the color of the haze over the Ozark Mountains just before sunset. But would I get to be a close friend of hers? I don't know. I think that would be up to her.
Can you remind readers what the book On the Banks of Plum Creek is about and why it is important? I mean, in addition to just the setting being Walnut Grove.
I'm so glad you asked this question because we get so caught up in history, we get so caught up in the Walnut Grove of the television series that sometimes we forget to talk about Walnut Grove or the books themselves. And of course, On the Banks of Plum Creek takes place near Walnut Grove. Now, in the book, she doesn't mention the name of the town. In Pioneer Girl, she's very clear about Walnut Grove, and Walnut Grove is what she called a new town. But On the Banks of Plum Creek is important for several reasons, I think. This was the fourth book in the Little House series. Of course, she started with Little House in the Big Woods, then went to Farmer Boy, and then Little House on the Prairie. But the series itself really wasn't launched until Little House on the Prairie. Because when Wilder wrote Little House in the Big Woods, she was thinking she would just try to save some of Pa's stories that she loved as a child. And then with Farmer Boy, she wrote the mirror image of her own family story. So she had a story for girls with Little House in the Big Woods, and she had a story for boys with Farmer Boy. But those two books were so unexpectedly popular that she suddenly realized she had a series on her hands. And so that launched with Little House on the Prairie. But On the Banks of Plum Creek went to someplace new because the book really is character-driven. It focuses on Laura and how Laura changes and evolves as she's getting older. The book is also different because we start seeing some of the first and original themes that will carry through the rest of the series. And the book is important as well because when it was published in 1937 as the fourth book in the series, Laura Ingalls Wilder wasn't yet a literary legend, but she was on the way to becoming a literary legend. And she gave a speech at the Detroit Book Fair in 1937, and she talked about her childhood. She talked about the series. She said, a quote that I love, that she had told the truth, but not the whole truth, as we all know. And she also framed what she viewed the whole series, which was a personal look at how the frontier came to be, at the history of the frontier, from the very first settlers all the way to the establishment of towns and communities. So in that speech, we can see what she was trying to do the whole series, and On the Banks of Plum Creek is critical there because it establishes that the family has moved west and they are trying to build a successful life for themselves on a new farm. So I think that was really important. The other thing about On the Banks of Plum Creek, from a literary perspective, that's important, is that it was the first of Wilder's books to receive a Newbery Honor Medal. All of the rest of the books in the series were honor books, but On the Banks of Plum Creek was the first one. And her editor was so impressed with On the Banks of Plum Creek as a book, as a novel, that when other authors asked her for a good example of what we would now call a middle grade novel, back in the 1930s they called it a juvenile novel, Wilder's editors always said, read On the Banks of Plum Creek. It's a sterling example of a juvenile novel. So I think all of that is really important. But there are a couple of other things I want to say about On the Banks of Plum Creek, and then you can ask me some more questions. But On the Banks of Plum Creek also establishes Wilder as a writer of realism for young readers. The whole episode with the grasshopper plague, which occupies a central position in the book, is critically important. And she doesn't pull any punches there. The depiction is very harsh and very gripping and very moving. She doesn't gloss over the fact that the family has lost everything. I think at one point Pa says, it says something like, we have no more chance of making a harvest or a crop next year than we do of flying. And I think because Wilder was so realistic and she didn't flinch in the face of her fictional family's hardships, that approach really resonated with her readers because they were young readers of the Depression era in the 1930s, and their own families were going through similar crises. So I think that sense of realism that comes through in On the Banks of Plum Creek is really important. And so too are the introductions of key characters, secondary characters, like the Nelson family, for example, who are good neighbors to the fictional Ingalls family. And then, of course, there's the character we all love to hate, Nellie Olson, who makes her first appearance in On the Banks of Plum Creek, and then we see her again in later books in the series. So for all of those reasons, I think On the Banks of Plum Creek is a beautiful and wonderful book.
Yes, I would agree with that. Moving on from On the Banks of Plum Creek, how does The Walnut Grove and Pioneer Girl differ from On the Banks of Plum Creek? And what does that reveal about the historical Ingalls family's experiences in Minnesota?
That's a really good question. In the books, the fictional family is always moving west. They moved from Wisconsin to Indian Territory. From Indian Territory, they moved on to Minnesota and Walnut Grove. From there to Dakota Territory. So they're always moving west. But as you know, the historical Ingalls family did a lot more moving back and forth. And they actually moved to Walnut Grove from Wisconsin. And they moved to Walnut Grove. They lived there for a short period of time. I call that Walnut Grove Part 1. Then from Walnut Grove, they moved east and not west to Burr Oak, Iowa. They lived in Burr Oak for a short period of time. And then they moved back to Walnut Grove for Walnut Grove Part 2. In Walnut Grove Part 1, in Pioneer Girl, much of that follows more or less what happens on the banks of Plum Creek. In that first section, the historical family's first experiences in Walnut Grove, that's when the grasshoppers descend. That's when Pa fights off the grasshoppers, and they eventually, the real family doesn't stick it out on the farm. The real family ends up selling out and selling the farm at Plum Creek and moving east. Now, at roughly the same time that all of this was happening in Walnut Grove Part 1, Laura Ingalls Wilder's little brother was born, Freddie. He was born in Walnut Grove. Freddie only lived for 9 months and actually died as the family was moving east to Burr Oak, Iowa. When the family comes back to Walnut Grove after leaving Burr Oak, they don't resume farming. They live in town. They become a town family. And so Walnut Grove Part 2 in Pioneer Girl is kind of like a mini Peyton Place, to tell you the truth. Laura Ingalls Wilder focuses a lot on the town people there. Pa, for part of the time that they were living in Walnut Grove at that time, was a justice of the peace, and his office was in their front room. And when he would hear a case, the family, the girls, would go into the kitchen, but they could still overhear all the cases. So if you read Pioneer Girl Part 2, Walnut Grove, you're struck with the soap opera world of intrigue and infidelity and love triangles and greed. And it's a very different kind of world. In real life, the Ingalls girls were not as protected, not as sheltered from the grittiness of frontier life as they are in the Little House books. That comes through very clearly. But while Walnut Grove Part 2 deals with some very dysfunctional families, what also comes through very clearly is that the real Ingalls family provided a loving atmosphere for their daughters. They supported them with love and a great deal of, I think, freedom, and encouraged the girls educationally. Now, the other thing that you see in Walnut Grove in Pioneer Girl is that the Ingalls family, when they got to Walnut Grove that second time, they were pretty much broke. And their financial situation did not improve in Walnut Grove, and they were constantly struggling there. That comes through very clearly in Pioneer Girl. In fact, Laura herself, as a preteen, was a hired girl. She worked for 50 cents a week for a time at the Masters Hotel in Walnut Grove. She also did some work, was hired out at other families during that period, because the family needed additional income. So you get a different picture of the Ingalls family, particularly in Walnut Grove Part 2, Pioneer Girl, than you do in the novels.
That is definitely true. And definitely, when I read it, I remember being kind of surprised at the differences in that second part, because those are not talked about at all on the banks of Plum Creek originally.
But I do want to say, before we leave Walnut Grove in that question, is that there are characters characters in Walnut Grove Part 2 that that Laura Ingalls Wilder found endearing. And I think about the shopkeepers who knew that the Ingalls girls didn't have a lot of money, but they admired this beautiful high-backed comb. It's an ornamental comb that would go back in the back of a woman's hair and set on kind of the top of her bun in the back. And the Ingalls girls loved that comb, and they wanted it for Ma. And so they would save their money, and the comb cost 50 cents. But after saving for several weeks, they only had 40 cents. And they went into the store, and they would go into the shop occasionally just to look at the comb and admire it. And when they had 40 cents, the shopkeeper asked them, how much money do you have? And Laura and Mary said, we have 40 cents, but we'll work to get the next 10 cents. And the shopkeeper just wrapped up the comb in a piece of paper and sent it home for Laura and Mary. He didn't wait for that extra 10 cents. So despite the soap opera atmosphere of the world in Walnut Grove that we see in Pioneer Girl, there were also these very heartwarming moments that come through too.
Yes. When focusing on Laura's work, it's hard to ignore the other things that have come about from her writings. What value do you feel that some of the movies and TV shows that have come about add or detract from the messages she conveyed in her books and even her original manuscript?
The television series and the movies that have spun off from the Little House books are kind of highly reimagined worlds. They're different from the Little House books originally. They're softer. They're a little bit more sentimental. I think the best example of that is if you just put up a picture of the real Charles Ingalls and compare it to Michael Landon on television. They're totally different characters, just in the way that they carry themselves. So the television series and the movies have been more sugar-coated, I think, and a little bit more sentimental than the original books are. And so, particularly when Pioneer Girl came out, I talked to reporters quite frequently, and many of the reporters had young children, and so they would start their children on Little House books, and they didn't realize that that the books themselves had so much depth and maturity and were in themselves a gritty, more realistic version than what they expected from the television series. That said, the television and movie adaptations have brought new viewers and new readers to Laura Ingalls Wilder's world. And I've met some people who are clearly in the TV movie camp, some people who are clearly in the Little House book camp. And then I've met a lot of people who love and embrace both, despite the very distinct differences between the books and the movies and films.
Yes. As you've researched the life of Laura, were there any startling revelations that deeply changed your opinion of her as a person?
I wouldn't say that there were revelations that changed my ideas of her as a person. There were revelations that changed my appreciation for her as a writer and as an artist. And some of the revelations were very, very small. Going back to that really cold holiday break that I spent at WSU, initially looking through microfilm of Pioneer Girl, on essentially the second page, I got a huge jolt. And that's when I found out that Pa sold Jack very early on in the family's real history. He sold Jack to a man with who was buying a couple of ponies because Jack and the ponies were pretty much inseparable. And I remember I had to read and reread that passage because, of course, Jack goes all the way through to By the Shores of Silver Lake. And he has this beautiful elegiac death, one of the most moving. If you love dogs, you'll love this description of Jack's death. It's perfect, it's beautiful, and it's heart-wrenching. And to realize that she made that up, that Jack himself was essentially a fictional character throughout the first 3 books that focus on the Ingalls family, I was shocked. And to be able to create such a memorable, believable, and incredible canine character made my opinion of Wilder as an artist grow even more. But then the more research I did, the more I began to understand that Laura Ingalls Wilder knew how to use the facts of her life to tell a better story, that she could transform them into fiction in new, novel, and creative ways. And so over time, the more research that I did on her, the more my opinion of her as a classic American author grew.
Yes. Can you tell us what you're currently working on?
Well, I'm writing fiction again. I love writing historical fiction, so I'm working on a series of short stories. I don't really think of them as being that historical, but it's set in the 1960s and 1970s. So for me, it feels like I'm going back to my teenage years. I'm writing about that. And I also have a new Wilder project in the works. It's still too soon for me to say too much more about it, but I'm still working on a Laura Ingalls Wilder project.
That's exciting. How has your connection with the work of Laura Ingalls made a difference in your life?
I think Laura Ingalls Wilder has cast a long shadow over my life as a writer. When I grew up in the Missouri Ozarks in the 1960s, I wasn't aware of any writers in my part of the world. I assumed that writers lived in New York or England or California, not in the Missouri Ozarks. And then when I was about 10 years old, and I was quite a reader, I was a bookworm, and I already knew I wanted to be a writer. One of our neighbors told my mom about Laura Ingalls Wilder and said, well, you know, she wrote just down the road at Mansfield. And I was surprised and very curious. And so I checked out my first Laura Ingalls Wilder book at the Bookmobile. I got the only one they had on the shelves that day. It was Little Town on the Prairie. And for me, it just kind of opened up the possibility that, yes, it is possible to be a writer and come from the Missouri Ozarks, because look at Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I was always fascinated that the Laura of the books went on to write them. For me, that was really the most powerful message that I took from those books. And then when I was in my 20s, I moved to South Dakota, where 5 of the Little House books are set. And that's when I began to realize that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a much better writer than I've even imagined. When I saw how perfectly, how descriptively she captured the South Dakota prairies, I realized she's really a writer with a capital W. And I started writing about Laura Ingalls Wilder while I was in South Dakota. I worked for the South Dakota Division of Tourism. I was a publicity writer, and my beat was all things literary and historical. So Laura Ingalls Wilder intersected there. And so I talked to people in DeSmet back in the 70s who had known the Ingalls family. I wrote press releases, brochures, all kinds of material about Laura Ingalls Wilder then. And I also began to realize while I was doing my research that years before, I had worked with a photographer back in Springfield, Missouri, who had actually photographed Laura and Almanzo Wilder. I didn't know that when I was working for her, but she probably took the last photograph of Almanzo Wilder back in 1949. So I felt like I had all of these close connections. And then now, of course, I live in Oregon, which is where Pa always wanted to go and end up. So she's really cast a long shadow over my life. She helped inspire me and fueled my passion to become a writer. And now she has been the focus of much of my research and writing as a professional writer. So I'm very grateful to Mrs. Wilder's ghost.
And so are we. Thank you, Pamela, for being our guest this evening. The horses are hungry and need some food. So before we leave for the long journey back to reality, do you have any last thoughts or a favorite Laura quote before you help us get the horses into the barn for the night?
Yes, I do. And my favorite quote, it's actually a passage. It's from By the Shores of Silver Lake. So here we go. They were beside the wagon only a moment. Then away they went in the smoothest, prettiest run, down into a little hollow and up and away, straight into the blazing round sun on the far edge of the west. The flaming red shirt and the white horse vanished in the blazing golden light. Laura let out her breath. Oh, Mary! The snow-white horse and the tall brown man with such a black head and a bright red shirt, the brown prairie all around, and they rode right into the sun as it was going down. They'll go on in the sun around the world. Mary thought a moment. Then she said, Laura, you know he couldn't ride into the sun. He's just riding along on the ground like anybody. But Laura did not feel that she had told a lie. What she had said was true, too. Somehow that moment when the beautiful free pony and the wild man rode into the sun would last forever. That's my favorite quote. And it gets at what Laura could observe and say and see, and it gives us the hint of the writer that she would become.
Thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.